how I came to be married. Now that's an interesting story, but um, and as with everything, it's hard to compartmentalize and extract it from the overall events of my life. Um, I hmm,
Well, I suppose we could just take it from where you had now left Canada. Did you marry in the States, or was this after you'd come to Canada?
well, what happened is uh, I had met someone and become involved with them who was a close friend of my sister. Uh, she was attending university uh, in Missouri, and I I spent a lot of time with her over the course of the better part of a year. When I was offered the position in Canada and I jumped on it, I announced to my family and everyone else that that's what I was doing, including uh, this woman. Uh, her name was Mary Ann. It's probably easier to go ahead and
Yeah,
identify
I was
her.
just going to say let's pick a name, even if it's a pseudonym, it's fine.
Yeah. But I was very surprised by the response of everyone. I mean, universally, everybody assumed and expected that we were going to get married, which is not something that had entered my mind at all. And well, here, in order to put this into a context, I need to provide some background. But my response to this was surprise, and then an, oh, yes, I guess I have to.
Mm.
I didn't want to, I hadn't expected to. Um, but here I was faced with a situation that I am expected to. Now, the background of this, as a part of my weird childhood, I was indoctrinated with a lot of strange ideas about uh, human sexuality and relationships between men and women. That combined with being very much an outsider, never having gone through the usual adolescent socialization processes and things like that, I was totally inexperienced in this realm. This was the first woman I'd ever actually dated. I mean, there'd been isolated instances when I'd actually gone out with someone to a movie or to dinner, but I'd never been in a relationship. I was also totally sexually inexperienced. And I had indoctrinated myself basically in a lot of Catholic values. And so, whereas I hadn't had sex with this woman, we had engaged in various kinds of petting. So, first of all, was this expectation from her family, my family, and anybody else that knew us. Second was this kicking in of this Catholic guilt. Oh, I've been, I hadn't had sex per se, but had been sexually involved with this woman. Oh, that creates kind of a moral obligation. So, well, the arrangement that we made, I mean, I was offered this position on fairly short notice. I think I had about a month to get ready to go. And this all happened in a short period of time. So I did agree that, yes, I guess we're getting married. And I'll come back for the wedding in a month or two after I leave. And all the arrangements were made. So I went to Canada, and I was there for a month or so before the wedding was scheduled. And I wrestled with this every day. I wasn't ready for this. I didn't want to do this, but I couldn't see any way out. So I went back. I mean, the tragedy of this is the effect it had on the other person, of course, right? But I quite honestly believe I was doing the right thing, you know, the morally appropriate thing. And I did my best. And so that's how I ended up being married. And yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that.
Okay, so because I mean that is, I think you're right. It doesn't sound ideal because when one gets married, it's usually one hopes it would be, at least in Western contexts, of you really love this person, you want to spend the rest of your life, and this just seems like the way to tie up that relationship with a beautiful bow. And in your case, you were doing it because you felt you had to, not because you really wanted to. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
I was really very, very poorly socialized. I was a stranger in a strange land. I was trying to conform to social norms that I knew nothing about and didn't understand.
Right. So you could, I mean, I think that's a wonderful way to put it. It's you were social on the social, following the social convention, but without really understanding what that convention means and what it's based on.
Yeah. And as I later learned, it would have been much more in keeping with social convention for me not to have gotten married. But I didn't know that at the time.
Well, I'm assuming this is in the 70s sometime?
This was in the late 60s.
Late 60s. Well, I mean, and that
1968.
1968.
Yeah, 68.
Okay. Because, I mean, at that time, there was a lot of this sort of counterculture social upheaval where it became quite acceptable for people to live together or even have children together without becoming married, right?
Yes. And I had been in close contact with that counterculture, the whole hippie movement, and everything like that. But I found myself at that time in a very conservative part of society that really rejected and saw as absolutely terrible, immoral, everything else, the kinds of behaviors and so forth that were represented by this counterculture. It was rejected across the board. The sex, drugs, rock and roll, free love, all of this stuff was, it was manifest evil in the world.
It's really interesting because I think this is a really clear example of where you've said you had difficulty saying no and setting boundaries with people.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Interesting.
It was really impossible for me and to create a situation that would produce any kind of conflict was something that I just naturally avoided at all costs.
Yeah, the conflict avoidance. Okay, cool. So the two of you are now living in Canada. Whereabouts was this?
In Winnipeg.
Winnipeg, that's right. And so she is a cook at a health food store and a health food restaurant, excuse me. And Kemananda came in and played the sitar, and you had the broken sitar. We've talked a little bit about that. And essentially after that night, you started meeting with him and repairing the sitar and talking Dharma. And you also said that he had a small group of people that would get together and meditate together. So perhaps we could pick up there and just go into how that went. So we're sort of moving into that phase where you're much more engaged and you've identified Buddhism, because you said that he had said to you, like the Buddha said, come and see for yourself, and that intrigued you, that connection with the scientific method, so to speak.
Yes, I did. I became progressively, over a short period of time, progressively more and more identified with Buddhism, began to engage in Buddhist meditation practice, I had mentioned to you before that I'd been trying for several years to meditate using Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and other writings of Vivekananda's, and not particularly successful. Then I'd gotten involved with the transcendental meditation movement, which was more rewarding and exciting. When I encountered Kemananda, he had established a vihara, a living place in Winnipeg, that there was a fairly sizable group of people living together in one large house. And the meditation that Kemananda was teaching was pretty much the Mahasi style meditation, but he was also working towards, with this group of people, a 3-year meditation retreat. So he was offering regular, frequent weekend meditation sessions, then longer retreats, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. He did a 3-month retreat as part of his lead up to the 3-year retreat. So this is the situation that I was introduced into. And as a result of these discussions, I became very intrigued, wanted to do more, wanted to know more. And so, of course, one of the things I did was to begin with attending these weekend meditation retreats, and then also being involved in the longer retreats as they developed. So it was both the intellectual, the first part of the Eightfold Path, learning about Buddhism, right understanding, and then being introduced to the practice in this particular form. And I felt in many ways that I sensed that there was much more to be gained in this meditation style that was being offered than even I had discovered in transcendental meditation. And certainly the fact that it was coupled with a much more clearly articulated and systematic kind of Dharma teaching appealed to me enormously. So, of course, I continued with my graduate studies, my thesis research, everything else. But this really did become much more the focus of my life. It was the most promising thing that had arisen for me yet in terms of what had been my goal as a seeker from the time of leaving home. And of course, there were these incredibly tantalizing ideas about emptiness, which was basically, it gave me a way to think of what I had discovered and what I had realized, that everybody basically is living in their own reality. I had been looking for somebody that knew what was really going on and had come to the conclusion that nobody did. And then here was this idea, this concept of emptiness. And it just, wow, I know about that.
Right. So you'd had all these observations, and then you came across something that actually gave an explanation or a framework for those observations, and that was really exciting.
Gave a framework. Yeah. Gave a framework. It did. Suddenly I had a context in which to understand what it is that I had observed, seen, and found so profoundly disturbing. I have to do something. Yeah, I found this very, it was a very disturbing aspect of the greater reality that I had discovered, and I didn't have any context to put it in.
Right.
It was great. It was frightening.
So that disturbing observation or whatever was what exactly?
Basically, that everybody was living in their own private version of reality, and none of them corresponded particularly well to either to each other or to any discernible underlying truth.
Right. And nobody talks about it, right?
Right.
It's almost as if there is an elephant in the room, and people just walking around it and refusing to acknowledge that it's there.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, people so used to having the elephant in the room that they don't even know it's there anymore.
Yeah. And I think that is quite a common problem, and in psychology is talked about this fallacy that, just assuming that everybody sees and understands the world in the same way you do, right, causes a lot of problems and conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's the normal situation. My situation was different in that I knew I didn't know anything about reality. I was desperately hoping that somebody else did. And to discover that nobody did was pretty disconcerting. But I continued my search. And then there'd been different occasions where I thought I was on the right track, but this felt like so much more so than anything else I'd ever encountered.
And this is one of, I think, the beauties of Buddhism, is that it's got this rich, complex theoretical and philosophical framework, but then it also has a corresponding practice to it, and those just dovetail together so well. They to quote Bhikkhu, they reinforce each other, and synthesize. What's the word? There's a kind of a symbiosis or a synergy that happens between those two elements, the Dharma and the doctrine and the discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
So there you are. You are doing the weekend retreats. You're continuing with your graduate studies in what?
In physiology and biochemistry.
Physiology and biochemistry, and then you are now married as well. So your life seems to be going forward in all spheres. So what happened next? So there you are doing the weekend retreats and preparing for a 3-year retreat. That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah. Yes, and as I said, becoming more and more completely identified with Buddhism and Buddhist practice. Well, I did finish my graduate work, got my Ph.D., and about 2 years before that happened, my wife returned to Missouri to be with her parents and took our year-old son with her, which I felt badly about her unhappiness and frustration, but quite frankly, I couldn't have thought of anything that would be better for my situation. And unfortunately, as it turned out, I think that what she expected and what she intended is that she wanted me to give up my graduate program. She wanted me to go back to the U.S., to Missouri. And she thought by doing this, that's what would happen. That's what I would do. Instead, what I did was to gather up all of our belongings. By this time, we owned the place we lived in. We had bought a unit in one of the first condominium complexes in Canada, certainly the first in Canadian Prairie provinces, and it was so much more accessible. I mean, for me to be able to have done that on a graduate student salary was kind of amazing in itself. So what I did in response to her leaving was to gather up all of her belongings that she got on a plane and flew away one Sunday morning. I took her to the airport. I gathered up everything, rented a trailer, drove it back to Missouri, gave it all to her. I think she expected that I was coming to stay. And I think she was really crushed that never happened. Instead, I sold the condominium that we had together, and we hadn't accumulated very much equity. What little there was, I provided to her because I felt like I didn't need much. At that point, I ended up I needed a place to live. There wasn't much space in the vihara, but they did have a large closet storage area in the downstairs of that house that was not occupied. And so I set up housekeeping on a mattress in that storage closet. I became a part of the vihara there. And also, not too long after that, there was another woman close to my age who was a part of that group, and we ended up sharing that closet. and so I ended up not too long after in another relationship, a much more compatible one, a much more comfortable one. I was really happy with that.
Well, look, I have to jump in here for a second and just ask you, though, because people are going to find this difficult to understand. You had a 1-year-old child and you were in a relationship, and sure, it wasn't a relationship that you had, were invested in from the start and really wanted. But I would want to know what your thinking was around that, and the relationship with the child and all of that. And I'm sorry if this is too intrusive, but it does seem like a sort of a strange thing to happen, and then to go into another relationship straight afterwards, or not straight afterwards. It seems that there was some period of time
in between.
Yeah.
This was extremely troubling to me, and I had so many conflicts. On the one hand, my going to Winnipeg was a resumption of the interrupted life that I had started. After I moved to Winnipeg, I completed my bachelor's degree. I did a master's degree, and didn't take much more than a year, and then launched into my Ph.D. work. This had been of paramount importance to me. It was, this goes back to when I left the streets, got a job, got into university. This was a huge thing for me. And you'll recall the opportunity to continue this trajectory going to Canada had preceded the idea that I would be marrying someone. Even more fundamental importance to me was as a seeker, trying to discover some kind of truth. When I began to identify so strongly with Buddhism, there was a tension and increasing conflict between these two very different aspects of my life. My marriage, this child, well, there's something else. I suspected that the reason we had a child was, I don't know how to say this or whether I even should. I was already being pulled in 3 directions: the responsibility toward the woman I'd married, my responsibility to my PhD program, and this had been a major life goal, and my newfound discovery of Buddhism. So I was already being torn in three directions. My wife said, "I'm pregnant." This was this this only added to the existing tension. I was responding to the situation in not a very sophisticated way, but on the basis of these three different things. My wife very much had been under so much pressure from her to give up the graduate program, to go back to the States. While there was some degree of feasibility, and I'd done far more, I'd accomplished things against far greater odds in the past. The odds, if I abandoned the Ph.D. program, the odds of being able to get into another one were not very good. So there was, not only was the feeling of responsibility and commitment to a marriage, and then all of a sudden having a child coming, and the tension between Buddhism and my PhD program. Actually, the other thing is, I didn't know where I would discover this kind of opportunity for Buddhism if I went back to the States. I had never encountered anything like that there. So I was really being torn in a lot of directions. I experienced, just a lot of internal vacillation. Well, I guess I have to do this. No, wait a minute, I can't. Well, I guess I have to do that.
Yeah.
I was just being pulled in all kinds of different directions. I was also responding to a variety of different influences. My PhD advisor, who had been the person who originally brought me to Canada as an employee to create the electron microscope facility, had been against my being married in the first place, had always said this was a big mistake. It's interfering with your career. It's all these other things. He was a mentor. He was a greatly important figure in my life. And so, of course, very influential in my trying to sort things out.
So it does seem that when your wife decided to go back to Missouri, that in fact that was a great relief to you, because it was relieving some of that tension, and it's almost like, well, I'm glad she made the decision so I don't have to.
Well, there was some of that, but I wouldn't say that was as big a factor as, oh my God, I have failed. What do I do? I'm caught in this horrible dilemma, this quandary. And I was more paralyzed by the situation than relieved by what had happened. There was some bit of a sense of relief, but it was pretty minimal. And there was much more tension and internal conflict developed by this than there was any relief.
Okay, right.
So it was much more just a peripheral thing. And my response to it was, if this is what she wants, I mean, this was terrible for me, but perhaps it's better.
Okay.
And okay, what do I do? The fact that I took basically everything that we owned to her, including the small amount of equity from the sale of our residence, this was a Buddhist value that I had incorporated that really fit rather well in the austere kind of lifestyle that I'd always led. Well, I don't really need much of anything. I can do this. And so I did. But one of the effects of that is that my son was now so far away. I did go back several times and visited. Those visits were not very pleasant. I tried to maintain some kind of relationship with my infant son, but I didn't have the financial resources in so many other ways. I was just incapable of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was haunted by the sense of, of having failed in a very important responsibility, uh, for a very long time. I just, uh, I couldn't really escape it, but I couldn't really see a viable alternative.
Mm-hmm.
And I did probably what most people would do in a situation like that, is I immersed myself just that much more deeply in Buddhist studies and practice and getting my Ph.D. done.
Right. Well, thank you.
It was easier than dealing with an impossible situation that I couldn't do anything about, that I was powerless to respond to. Well, somebody could look at that situation and say, well, you could have done this, you could have done that. But I didn't have anybody to suggest those things to me, and I didn't figure anything out.
And then, of course, your mentor was very, very keen on you with your academic work and all of that. Yeah, I think that, thank you, Culadasa. I know that was sort of quite intrusive, but I think that was really helpful to understand exactly what was going on here, because from the outside, it could seem quite callous. But it does make sense to me where you sort of went, well, okay, perhaps this is in everybody's best interests, and I'll do whatever I can to, support my wife and
Right.
child. But perhaps this is better overall for everybody, and everybody can get on with the things that they really want to.
And and the external influences basically ended up encouraging me to do that. I mean, as far as my PhD advisor was concerned, he was 100% in favor of her leaving and taking the child with me, with her, right? He said, great, now you have a chance to really, really develop a powerful career.
Wow.
And I was really suffering in a lot of conflict, and the other people in the Vihara and Kaimananda and things like that were trying to help me, not giving me advice, but trying to help me from their point of view. I could not fail to appreciate the similarity of the Buddhas having left home with a young
I was
child.
just thinking that, yes, exactly.
And what basically I was getting from that direction was, see, this is the way life is. It's suffering. It's unsatisfactory. Nothing about it is, this is the way life is. Accept it. And of course, my experience matched that perfectly. Yeah, this is the way the life is. You just have to accept it. You can't solve these problems. You can't do anything.
Right. And of course, if you want to compare it to the story of the Buddha, basically that story is saying, well, if you want to be relieved of the suffering, to be free of the suffering, then you have to leave behind these things. And so it sort of served as a model for you of how to get out of this suffering.
That's right. It began to appear like, well, once again, fate had intervened and was, that I had to recognize that this was something that was positive. That didn't help my very human feelings about it very much, but it gave me something else to rest on so that I wasn't just totally floundering. And I did, like I say, what I think almost anybody would have done in that state of confusion, is cling to the most solid things that there were.
Yeah.
That's what I did.
Throw yourself into your work, into your academic work, and into your Buddhist studies.
Okay.
So there you are, living in the Vihara on a mattress, like Harry Potter in a cupboard under the stairs. And I don't know why, I just keep thinking of the whole Harry Potter story. And now you've met somebody who is also a spiritual seeker, and the two of you have started a relationship which felt more compatible to you.
One thing about that Buddhist community is that I felt more supported and understood than I ever had in my life before. I felt like it was a part of something. Kemananda just, he was such a, he was a charismatic person. And he took such an intense interest in me. I, of course, responded to that. The other people around me appreciated the difficulty of my situation and were doing everything they could to be supportive. And this young woman was part of that. And well, Kema did encourage that relationship when he sensed that there was something developing there. And so whatever reservations that I might have had, as a matter of fact, I continued to wear my wedding ring for months afterwards. And Kema Ananda said once, 6 months afterwards, why don't you get rid of that ring? You know, why do you keep wearing that? And so likewise, as a part of that, he encouraged this relationship as well. So I had a lot of affirmation for what happened, in spite of the internal conflicts, the irreconcilable and unresolvable internal conflicts that I was experiencing. Like I say, I was being supported and grounded in the other two major aspects of my life in the rightness of what was happening. And I didn't really feel like it was that much of what I was doing. It's more, I really did feel like this is something that's happening. Mm-hmm. The language that Kemananda used and that I have so often used is the unfolding of suchness. And he would say, this is just the unfolding of things. You either try to push the river or you go with it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that is sometimes one of the big criticisms of I don't know, Buddhism, but the way of thinking of, well, don't resist things, you know, because you can't, because when you try to resist them and change them, then you're just creating more of a problem. Right. But I mean, it does sound to me like you were really missing your son, and that you were just really and your, or that part of your life just felt like it had not gone the way you had wanted at all, and that it was still something that was heavy on your heart.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it was. Actually, it was the beginning of a period of internal conflicts and major decisions and sort of an internal discomfort that went on for quite a few years. After I finished my Ph.D., I chose, for various reasons, to accept a postdoctoral fellowship in Alberta, the University of Calgary Medical School. But at this point, and also it was within a month or so after having made that move, that I took the Upasaka ordination. I had another huge conflict between the profession as a scientist and Buddhist values. Well, there were several dimensions to this conflict. Both required an enormous degree of commitment of time and energy. So that was a conflict. But there were other conflicts of values that, now I'll speak a little bit about the problem that I had with the way science worked. My mentor, my Ph.D. advisor and mentor, really understood how the system. He really understood how the system worked, and knew how to make it work to his advantage. And so I learned how the system worked, but I was also disgusted and repelled by it. There were several different factors. One was I had idealized science and scientists and felt like I discovered that science was as full of mediocrity as anything else. Perhaps no surprise to anybody else, but to me, it was very disillusioning. But a lot of science was just plodding mediocrity that made some minimalist contribution to the advance of human knowledge, but not the sort of inspiring things that that I was drawn by. Then there was a whole gaming part of the whole thing. If you wanted a paper published, you knew pretty well who was going to review the paper. So when you wrote the paper, you tweaked it to get the approval of the people who were going to review the paper. Now, the same thing was true of grants. And the grant application procedure involved usually, in addition to doing the innovative research that you were really interested in, including in your proposal work that was basically going to be reinforcing some well-known figure in your field. And indeed, once you received your grant funds, you had to do that research and publish it before you could start using whatever time and research money was left over to pursue your own research interests. And that was wasteful. And I felt very strongly it shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it was. And if you didn't play the game that way, you were either not going to get your grant renewed, or you weren't going to get it renewed for as much as you were asking for. This also involved the experimentation on and death of large numbers of animals that wasn't really necessary. I mean, the replication of the research of others is an important, absolutely essential part of science. But there was just too much useless redundancy at the cost of the lives of these animals. That created enormous conflict in me. Most research money was from government in those days, not from private interests. And so we were basically squandering the public's money and squandering the lives of all of these research animals as a part of the research game to ensure that we could continue our research and to continue the funding year after year and to get the papers published. And of course, the more papers that you produced from the time you received one grant until you applied for the next, the stronger your application was going to be. So there was a lot of producing of basically unnecessary, redundant research. Yeah. All of these things created an enormous conflict in me. And there was already this huge conflict, commitment, time, and energy between pursuing my Buddhist studies and practice and pursuing a career in science. Well, I ended up abandoning my postdoc before it was over, and retiring to a log cabin in the Canadian Rockies, a place called Mosquito Creek, between Lake Louise and Jasper, on the Jasper Highway. A log cabin with a wood stove, water from the creek outside, Mosquito Creek, no electricity.
Mosquito Creek does not sound like a place I'd like to go, to be honest.
Well, the name notwithstanding, it was an absolutely beautiful place. It was up what was it? I think something like 7,000 feet, 7,500 feet, something like that, in the Canadian Rockies. And it was exquisitely beautiful. It was also incredibly cold, minus 50 degrees for periods of 2 weeks at a stretch.
I take it we're talking Celsius here, just for people who are using Celsius. Okay.
Yeah.
That is as cold as it gets, right? In Canada.
Yeah. Well, there are places it gets colder, but not too
Yeah.
many. Yes, for those that are not familiar with it, minus 40 Celsius and 40 below zero Fahrenheit are the same temperature. That's where the two temperature scales meet.
Ah, okay. Right.
Um, so that gives people a pretty good idea of how
So
cold.
colder than that, yeah.
I mean, the routine of my life. I was with the woman who I'd met in the Vihara, and she was pregnant with our child. Our child was born during that retreat. That's basically what it was. It was a year-long retreat. I took with me a lot of Buddhist books, a lot of warm clothes, and some cross-country skis and snowshoes.
And so she was with you at the cabin, or?
She was with me in the cabin.
Okay. And your new infant's son or daughter?
My infant son.
Infant son.
Yes, he was born. He was born there, and he spent the first months of his life. To give you an idea about it, it was a log cabin with wood heat. Between the low temperatures and condensation, there was a layer where the walls meet the floor.
Yeah.
There was this layer of ice that built up and basically lined the whole thing. And the floor, you can imagine how cold the floor was. We could heat the cabin up. To be a comfortable temperature from about waist height on up. The floor would never heat up. And this is the floor that my wonderful sweet son spent the first months of his life crawling around on, and he's loved cold ever since.
Oh my goodness. Right. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
So no running water, wood stove in the middle of nowhere, basically.
I would get up in the morning. First thing I would do is go out and chop wood, bring wood in, cram as much wood as I could into I'd have wood prepared for this from the day before. I guess the first thing I'd do is get up in the morning and I'd cram as much wood as I could into the airtight wood stove we had, which was made from an oil drum. And that would begin heating up the cabin with the coals that were left from the night before. Then I'd go out and cut firewood. I'd go out and reopen the hole in the ice on the river, on the creek that had frozen overnight, bring the day's water supply inside. So once the wood was cut and the water for the day was brought in and the cabin was warmed up, then that started my day. Yeah.
My goodness, it sounds like Sorry?
It was a wonderful idyllic time. It was incredible.
Yeah. And so while you're living there, you said that this was kind of a retreat for a year. So can you talk a little bit about your practice during that time?
Yeah, so I was continuing to meditate. Well, I have to backtrack a little bit here. As I said, Kemananda was teaching primarily Mahasi style meditation. I found that, well, on the one hand, it gave me glimpses into what meditation had to offer that were consistent with what I had hoped for and had been expecting for all of those years, beginning with doing the Vedanta practices. But it was also a totally unsatisfactory practice for me. And that's when Jodhidhamma came into my life. He returned from a prolonged period of his life in Southeast Asia. And of course, I was fascinated by him when he joined our little community after coming back from Southeast Asia. And I spoke to him of the difficulties that I was having with what at the time I thought was not only the only Buddhist meditation, but I thought it was the Buddhist meditation. And he said, well, why don't you try doing a much more traditional practice? This is a practice that was just, it was early 1970s by then. So he said, this practice isn't even 100 years old. I said, really? Well, what did the Buddha teach? And so, well, I was introduced to Samatha Vipassana practice. And I really took off with that. That's the practice that I was doing in that year. In that retreat, once again, how did I get my life back on track? This thing that had been the biggest and most important thing in my life for so very, very long, I had decided that I had no choice but to give up and walk away from. What was I going to do now? By the way, I had in my possession letters from two very prestigious departments at very prestigious universities where I could have gone and begun my career as an academic faculty member and researcher. So I still, even though I had abandoned my postdoc without completing it, that's another difficult situation that created a lot of problems for me too. But not only had I abandoned that, I did have in my pocket this possibility of perhaps going back to that. Could I do that? Would I do that? Did I want to do that? A lot of this retreat was just trying to sort out my life. Where was I going? What were the most important priorities for me?
Right.
Here I was, just basically walking away from something I had invested so much in, including losing a wife and a son already. Here I had another son on the way. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it sure wasn't easy for you. You had every kind of challenge. And I presume that with those letters, or if you wanted to go into the academic faculty position, the research that would involve would again involve animal experimentation,
Yes.
which you were not comfortable continuing with.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. So that actually kind of closed that academic world's door to you, because in your field you really can't do that kind of work unless you are going to engage in animal experimentation.
That's right.
Yeah. So now you're doing the Samatha Vipassana practice, Vipassana practice, and so that is sort of essentially the kind of practice that you describe in your book, which is based on tranquility and calm abiding and insight. And this was taught to you. What was the chap's name? Jyoti Dharma?
Jyoti Dharma.
Jyoti Dharma. Right. So there you are. So now you are living in this cabin and practicing. How old were you, by the way, around about this time?
Oh, let's see. That was I would have been in my very early 30s, maybe about 32.
Maybe about 32, so early 30s. So you're living in the cabin with your son crawling around on the on the floor, and your partner. You had married this time around, had you?
Yes, we got married a week before my son was born. Unlike my first marriage, this was a marriage that I was happy to enter into because our relationship was very wonderful. Mm-hmm. But the main reason for it wasn't that. The main reason for it was, well, I want this child to, and once again, it's a bit of what would be considered now old-fashioned values. Mm-hmm. But I wanted my son to have a name and to be, not to have been an illegitimate child.
Right, and that was still pretty much normal during that in the 70s, right? It was still a little unconventional to have a child outside of wedlock, to use that term. Right.
Yeah. So it seemed like the very appropriate thing to do, and so that's what we did.
And so in the cabin, you're meditating every day. You're continuing your studies and your practice there.
Yes, when I went to this cabin, we didn't have a lot of belongings. We were still living very simply. So the main thing that I took was this library that I had been accumulating of Buddhist texts. That was a funny thing. I discovered the Buddhist Text Society in Sri Lanka. And I was ordering incredible numbers of books, during my postdoc period. And then even after we moved to the cabin, I continued ordering all of these books from Sri Lanka and from India,
Wow. I mean, they didn't have Amazon back then, but were they delivering to Mosquito Creek?
No, they were delivering to Lake Louise.
Uh-huh.
So I would just pick up my mail at Lake Louise. It was sent. They were all sent to general delivery in my name, and I would go to the post office.
And I presume that's where you would go to get groceries and that sort of thing as well for the cabin.
That's right.
And how long were you? Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So, and what did your practice look like? Because you said in the morning you get up, you go and collect water, chop wood, carry water, as the Zen expression goes, quite literally. And then what would your practice look like at that stage?
Okay, well, most of my day was spent, of a typical day was spent doing either study or practice. And so the routine would vary as to whether I would do more meditation in the morning or in the afternoon. Mornings, I've always been a morning person, and morning's been the best time for meditation. But, also in the afternoon and evening. So most of each day, that's a rigorous lifestyle. It takes a lot of time to maintain. Shopping and, food preparation, and there were the two of us, and we managed things. We both practiced, we both studied, and so there was a substantial amount of free time, maybe not as much as you would expect, because, the other thing I should point out, the cabin I was staying in was a part of a chain of youth hostels, and part of the deal that I had negotiated to be able to live there for that year was that for the first time I would try to keep people in the other youth hostels and keep them open over the winter. So we not only had to shop for our own supplies, we had to locate people and get them, settled into these other cabins on the Banff Highway and the Jasper Highway. We had to shop supplies for them, fill up these 100-pound propane tanks in Banff, and then transport them up into the mountains, into the much higher mountains, I should say. Banff is right in the mountains, but bring them up to the higher elevations, along with food and other supplies for these people. So this was all a part of our routine. It's not something that had to happen every day, but it had to happen on a regular basis to keep everyone supplied, looked after, make sure they had what they needed, that they were still alive and healthy. But there was lots of time for meditation and study. And so that was the thing that for us really defined our lives. The rest of it was just the inevitable maintenance of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so this went on for a year, you said?
Yeah, stayed there for a year.
And what happened next?
Well, as the year drew to a close, and I had made a lot of connections with people in Calgary before then and had maintained those. We did periodically go into Calgary to spend a few days with friends of ours there. And what emerged from that is a group of people had been wanting to establish a spiritual bookstore, a spiritual center in Calgary. And as the time came that I mean, there was some possibility that we could stay at the cabin in Mosquito Creek and continue what we were doing. But it seemed that the time was for me to move on, and we needed to find a new direction. And that seemed to present itself when this group of people wanted to finance a bookstore and spiritual center in Calgary. So that's what ended up happening. There was a beautiful, beautiful complex in downtown Calgary, an old building that had been restored. It had a big, beautiful natural foods restaurant, Tibetan carpet shop, all of this in open format. And there was a large space available that we could use for this bookstore. And we furnished it beautifully with handmade shelving and furnishings and of course, books. All of the books that I had ever wished I'd had access to were exactly the books that we wanted to have in our inventory for sale there. So that was a wonderful part of it as well. I didn't know where things were going to go, but it seemed like, you know, to use Kama's terminology, the natural unfolding of things. This was the way the river was going. So don't push the river, go with it. Something else that I say is interesting. The Sangha from Winnipeg and other people from the larger Sangha that it was a part of, the Namgyal Sangha from Ontario, they began migrating west at the same time I did. We actually staffed several of the hostels in the mountains over that winter with fellow students that were part of that Sangha. And then when I went to Calgary in the bookstore, the staff of the bookstore were members of that Sangha, and other people, including Jodi Dhamma and his assistant, they moved to Calgary as well. So the entire spiritual community that I had become a part of was being maintained, and significant elements of it were actually right there with me, first in the hostels in the mountains, then in the bookstore. The community was strong and growing stronger. So this kind of gives you an idea of what it was like with the bookstore. Everyone was so happy. I was so happy. Things were wonderful. I was still trying to solve the problem of what to do with my life. I had this wonderful education that was like this gift. And I felt like I really needed to give back. I needed to use that I felt a deep sense of obligation to find some way to use that. So I began looking for different ways to do that. I had become, I had taught classes both at the medical school where I did my Ph.D. and also at the medical school where I was doing my postdoc. I was very, very familiar with sort of an insider's view of the practice of medicine. And of course, I was, given my background, I was inevitably somewhat of a critic of that as well. So one of the things that appealed to me at that time, we're talking late 1970s, was the newly emerging field of complementary and alternative medicine. And I thought to myself, wow, maybe this is a place that I can use this wonderful education I have and do it in a way that serves humanity, do it in a way that helps make available to people a lot of things better than surgery and drugs. It just seemed so perfect. And so I began to get immersed in that. I began writing articles promoting different aspects of complementary and alternative medicine. We opened a whole section in the bookstore on these alternatives. And we drew the attention of a number of physicians who could see the value and benefit of this as well. I ended up meeting people that facilitated my traveling around Canada and even into the US, giving talks on this. So it began to look like a potential part of this new career that I was founding. I was somewhat mistaken, but I thought that I saw the light at the end of this dark tunnel that I'd been in for a couple of years now. Well, actually, if we go back to the emergence of the strong conflict when between my Ph.D. studies, Buddhism, and my wife leaving and taking our child, it had been going on for more years than that. It had been a dark tunnel of internal conflict, and but I felt like at that point I was seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So I threw myself totally into these things for the next few years.
And so what did that look like? You said you started writing articles and that there were physicians who were interested. So what evolved from that?
Well, in the continued evolution, eventually the trouble is that the bookstore we had, well, it was absolutely wonderful. It was called the One Earth Bookstore. It was wonderful and it was beautiful, but it was ahead of its time and it was in the wrong place. Right. There was another bookstore that was started approximately the same time in Vancouver called Banyan Books. Very, very similar. Everything about us was similar. But they had the advantage of being in Vancouver, which is far more liberal and forward-thinking community than was Calgary, very conservative. So our bookstore endeavor eventually collapsed of its own weight. There wasn't enough support from the community to sustain it. And so when that ended, I ended up moving to Vancouver, and I continued pursuits in I was looking for new avenues to continue my pursuits in complementary and alternative medicine. When I moved to Vancouver, the most immediate thing is I had to establish some kind of an income. So I did that by teaching courses at several community colleges in Vancouver. So that's something that I could do, teach classes several times a week, and had an income. It wasn't too long after that, though, that I had the opportunity to become a research associate at University of British Columbia in the Department of Healthcare and Epidemiology. A particular division within that department was called Health Promotion and Disease Prevention. The initials were HPDP. And most appropriately, everyone in that division and everyone else in the department and the university referred to us as the hippy dippy.
Right, because you were, I presume that this was, you were allowed to pursue these sort of alternative and unconventional approaches to medicine and health.
That's exactly right. Yes, that's what the hippy dippy division was formed to do. As I say, complementary and alternative medicine was the thing in those days, and I just happened to arrive looking for a place to fit in just when that was starting to take off.
Right, and so there you are. You're at UBC, and you're doing some research. I presume this type of research did not involve animal experimentation.
No, it didn't.
And so you were involved in research and teaching, if I understand correctly. You were teaching there as well, or?
Yeah, I was. I was engaged in a research project at the university, and I was still teaching courses at community colleges. I had an income from that, but the teaching at the community colleges augmented my income, and yes.
Right. So, and what were you, just out of curiosity, what were you teaching at the community colleges?
Mostly biology.
Biology.
Yes, which actually I absolutely loved doing. Well, at one point also I got to teach biochemistry, which I enjoyed thoroughly as well.
Excellent. So. Okay, so it does now seem that you've got sort of some stability and you're back on a kind of a career path again that you had been very regretful of having to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, the most important thing is I didn't have this feeling that I had been given this great gift and here I was throwing it away. Mm-hmm. Yes, I had a career. I had something I felt was important and comfortable and satisfying. And it was also totally compatible with Buddhist practice and meditation, because almost from its inception, the whole complementary alternative healthcare movement was in sympathy with meditation as an extremely important adjunct to these other approaches. So it was highly compatible. Everything just seemed to fit together and fall
together.
Yeah. There weren't any clear career pathways in that. It very much had to be invented every step along the way.
Mm-hmm. But you did say, and we might finish off just after we cover this point, you did say that it seemed like a light at the end of the tunnel, but that it wasn't quite what you were expecting. Could you perhaps comment on that?
Yes, well, when I got to Vancouver in that first year or so, 2 years, I guess, in the first 2 years, things did seem to be coming together, and there wasn't, as I say, there wasn't a clear path forward, but there seemed to be lots of potential. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what the major project that I was involved in healthcare and epidemiology. We had a very large grant from the Canadian Department of Defense. What they were interested in was if they implemented a lot of lifestyle improvement, health promotion activities, things like that in the military, what would be the benefits to the military? What they were proposing to do and what we were modeling, we created a very detailed computerized model of what would happen if in the Canadian military, lifestyle counseling was available to everyone in the military. Everyone had to undergo annual and semi-annual evaluation, that's part of the normal health checkup thing. But what would be added to it is specifically diet, weight, exercise, all of these other things that were part of a healthy, holistic lifestyle. What would be the benefits? Well, we modeled that in detail. Too much detail, as it turned out. I mean, the complexity of this model was amazing. But unfortunately, we also included in that longevity. What would be the ultimate expected increase in longevity? And as a part of that, because it was a detailed model, we also included the pensions that would be paid to military personnel.
I see the problem.
Yeah, you see the problem, and that's exactly what happened. That it had all kinds of benefits in terms of increased productivity of military personnel, increased health, fewer healthcare costs, but they all were going to live longer and collect pensions longer, and it ended up that it was going to be enormously more expensive for the military to implement this, not because of the cost of the program versus the benefits, but because simply that the amount of pensions that would be paid out. So they pulled the plug.
Oh gosh. Okay. Right. So I think that actually is a nice little cliffhanger to leave it on. If you're happy with that, they pulled the plug on this major project that was. It sounds like it was the central focus of your work at UBC for some time there.
You can see the potential of this. If, albeit Canada is a small country population-wise, but if the military of this country, of an entire country, were to implement this holistic approach to lifestyle, health, everything else, this would launch this whole movement into the mainstream in an incredibly powerful way. I mean, today we would be enjoying the benefits of that so very, very much had that worked out. So I just don't know. I guess you can probably see how crushing this was.
I can imagine.
Because of the huge hopes that had developed about, wow, what an opportunity. Yes, we'll really make this mainstream. We'll wake up everybody to the importance of these things.
And this could literally change the world, right? Or at least change the country.
Yeah. I have to confess, I've always wanted to change the world.
Well, and everybody does at that age specifically, but this was actually seemed like a feasible way to actually do it, because there's usually a big gap between wanting to change the world and actually figuring out a way that might accomplish that.
Actually, I have to tell you a little bit more about this. My enthusiasm for this was just unbounded. We were running this whole simulation on a big computer running Unix, but it was about that time that the first personal computers came out. So I went and bought a Radio Shack computer, a little television to use as a monitor, and a cassette tape drive for storage. And I started writing nutrition programs, which I spent a year or so designing a program where people could input. I had a list of 200 some odd dietary items that people could go through and indicate whether they used them once, twice, or 3 times daily, weekly, monthly, things like that. And then the program I'd written would analyze their diet on the basis of what they had self-reported eating, and would also then, as a part of it, what it printed out would be recommendations for what they could change to reduce this in your diet from your current levels, and to add this to your diet or increase this to produce a much healthier diet. And it worked really, really well. I started using that at various fitness centers in Vancouver. And so the people that bought memberships in these fitness centers would get to fill out the questionnaire, and I'd run their data and print out their report. And, so, well, you can see how it all fit together, and it was a beautiful thing. And then I actually got a contract from the Children's Hospital there to write a similar program for children with a condition called fetal ketonuria. It's where they cannot metabolize properly a particular amino acid, and it can cause severe damage to their nervous system if they do. So I wrote this program, and it was very similar. What a parent could do would be to fill out a questionnaire about the current family dietary preferences, and what they would be given back is a detailed guideline of how that could be modified to suit a child with PKU. It was enormously successful, because a parent with a newly diagnosed child with PKU could go through this process a few times, and as a result of it, they would learn to be able to make the appropriate adjustments, which had been something that had been very laborious and not very many people could understand or comply with that. And of course, the children suffered as a result. So it was a hugely valuable thing. That program for PKU was never a problem, but of course it only benefited a very small segment of society. As for my other dietary program, at University of British Columbia, there was this health fair that was being done now on an annual basis. It went on for 3 days. And so I got permission to set up my computer and to do these dietary analyses. I got shut down. I got shut down by the nutrition department because the recommendations that I was giving, the recommendations that my program was giving ran counter to the dietary advice that the department was providing, which was influenced by the makers of various foods, and including the dairy industry.
Yeah.
My program encouraged a decrease in the amount of dairy that people were consuming. And there were actually representatives of the British Columbia Dairy Board. I don't remember if that's the exact name of it or not. And they discovered what these things that I was producing there said about reducing dairy. They went to the members of that department, and yeah, they shut me down.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's amazing because a lot of these things you're talking about now are considered de rigueur, quite
Yeah, I know.
straightforward and sensible, but you were way ahead of your time with this stuff. And especially here in Canada, the dairy industry wields an enormous amount of influence. And yeah, so making an enemy of them is it's not a good idea. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground again today. Fascinating, just amazing, all the things you got yourself into and involved with, and using all of that. And I think we'll pick up there next time with sort of the collapse of the Hippy Dippy project, and see where we go next.
We might want to backtrack a little bit so that we can get into the spiritual aspect of things, the Buddhist aspect.
Yes. So
when I moved to Vancouver, a lot of the people in that Sangha came to Vancouver as well. So.
Excellent. All right, I'll make a note of that. So we will be looking at, during that time that you were at UBC teaching at the college, the community colleges, and working on these programs of yours, and that, what was going on in your spiritual life.
Yeah.
How does that sound?
Sounds good.